Hi, and welcome back to Jaffe Woodwinds. Today, I'm very honored to have one of the great flute players in the world, a young lady who's really set a standard for orchestral flute playing that is second to none. I'm very just glad that we have Lorna McGhee with us today, who was recently, earlier this year, announced as the new principal flute in the Boston Symphony. Lorna had prior been principal flute in the Pittsburgh Symphony for about 12 years. And prior to that was also a principal flute in the BBC, assistant principal flute in the BBC Orchestra in London. Um, so I have a lot of questions for Lorna today. I just heard a play 6 weeks ago with the BSO chamber players at Jordan Hall, and a wonderful concert. And so as a result of that, we were able to set up this date. And I'm very grateful that Lorna made time today for us. And Lorna, thank you again for agreeing to do this and spending your time with us today.
Thank you, Ed, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be doing this. Thank you for the
Well,
opportunity.
sure. I'd like to do this interview a little differently than many that I've done in the past. Usually I start out with questions like, when did you begin flute? Who were your early influences? I'd sort of like to come to it sort of like a novel where we start in the present day and then sort of reflect back. So as I mentioned, you were just recently announced and began your tenure with the Boston Symphony as their principal flute, coming from the Pittsburgh Symphony, which are two of the great orchestras in the world. You really pick well when you go to American orchestras. And one of the things that intrigues me and I think is a wonderful situation is that you're a very experienced player. You've been playing with major orchestras for many years. You've also been a soloist, a recitalist, a clinician. You've been a chamber player your entire career. So you came to this audition as a person who's just not right out of college, not a 25-year-old who's just doing their first gig. You've been through it, and yet you chose to go through the audition process and was successful. And I think it's quite wonderful that someone of your stature was willing to do this. And of course, now you've moved into this principal position in Boston, and one of the most really one of the greatest orchestras in the world, but also an orchestra whose first flute players have been among the greatest in the world, starting with Andre Macquart and then Georges Laurent, Dorio, Anthony Dwyer, going up to your predecessor, Elizabeth Rowe, who was wonderful. And so now you continue this tremendous tradition. So getting back to the actual question, what made you want to leave such a great orchestra as Pittsburgh and yet go through that whole audition process? And of course, you were successful, because it's quite unusual, at least in American orchestras.
Well, first of all, I have to say I love Pittsburgh, and so it was a question that I sat with for a very long time before I made the decision to put my name in the hat for Boston. Uh, as you say, Pittsburgh is a really great orchestra, very special, always plays with an enormous amount of heart and commitment, which is rare, actually, and I treasure that. And, here in Pittsburgh, my husband has a job at Carnegie Mellon University, and so I could have very easily and happily stayed where I was. At the same time, when the position became open in Boston, I never thought that would become open sort of in my in my career, because Elizabeth and I are a similar age. And so just her decision to go a different route, caused that to unexpectedly become open. And so, of course, Boston has an incredible legacy. And you mentioned these great flute players, the wonderful wind section, the artistic legacy of the orchestra, and the conductors that it has had there. over the years, and of course now this wonderful golden age with Nelson's. Um, and it was a question that I sat with for weeks and weeks, just trying to listen to my own inner voice about it. And ultimately, I felt I would regret if I didn't try for Boston. I thought this has unexpectedly come up in my lifetime, uh, at an age where I could try for it. And why not? Uh, Somehow I felt I still had another move in me to make. I've moved around a lot in life, and I just had this feeling that there was still another chapter. I'm so fortunate. My husband, who's also a musician, when I had sort of come to the conclusion that I wanted to take the audition and brought this up with him, how do you feel? What would you do in my shoes? And he wholeheartedly, 100% just said, I would absolutely go for it. So it's been a great team effort actually, and I'm very grateful for that as well, because it's not easy as two musicians, and here we were in
Oh,
Pittsburgh, both fortunate enough to have jobs, and
right,
and yet it was still a question to take very seriously
right.
and not to miss the opportunity. And fortunately it worked out. I mean, the whole process to go through, that's another story, you know at my age, rather than, I'm 52 now. So that was a different. I don't know if you want to go down that avenue right
I,
now, or do you want
I,
to leave that for later,
no,
or
no. Let's
okay.
address that because I think not only for yourself and your abilities to win a job, go through the audition process at age 52, but for the orchestra to choose someone who's not 20, 25, who's going to be in the orchestra for the next 40 years, let's say. uh, it's very unusual for an American orchestra in this day and age to choose a very experienced player of your caliber, but it also speaks to their artistic sensibility. They wanted the best player, and they made the right choice. And so I think it's a nice story to hear because we don't hear about that often on for um, any instrumentalist auditioning on any chair in major orchestras. You just don't see people at 52 years old moving into a principal position in an orchestra. Um, Maybe sometimes people might move over, uh, for a year or two when someone else is on sabbatical and all, but to win a position and then for you to leave a great orchestra as a principal, moving to another great orchestra as a principal, it's also unusual. So it's a wonderful story. And I think, as we had spoken earlier today, uh, gives encouragement to those players who are experienced and saying, well, I've had it, I'm 35 years old, I'm 40, yeah, that's it, I'm stuck. No, it doesn't necessarily work that way. And so I think you'll sort of be a role model
Oh, that's
for many of us.
it's so having made the decision to take the audition, then you have to deal with all the implications of that. And you're in a wonderful job. You have a certain uh, well, I mean, you have a certain reputation that you could fall flat on your face, and therefore the possibilities of it being more humiliating than taking an audition when you're in your 20s.
Yes.
Possibilities are great for
Yeah. Right.
for 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 that kind of uh, humiliation, actually. Uh,
So
um,
you may be thinking of it for the first time now.
oh no, believe me, I thought about it then. Because literally, you are also. I mean, it's a reality that you are competing against people that you've taught.
That must be a very odd and unique feeling. Can you tell us what your life was like during the months leading up to the audition? How did you manage to hold down your gig at the same time I was preparing for this audition, because I mean, that's a lot of preparation needed, even for someone like yourself who's probably played virtually all the repertoire that was asked. But knowing that you have to be pretty much perfect that day to nail the position.
Well, so yeah, it all goes hand in hand. So coming to terms with the possibility of making a total fool of yourself, um, then if you decide, if you decide to go through with an audition like this, it's like just somehow being at. There's a lot of mental work, as well as, of course, the musical preparation,
Yes.
and part of what helped me with the musical preparation was the attitude, whatever the outcome. I mean, when you take an audition, you really have to just be at peace with the fact that you probably won't get it. I mean, the odds are that you won't get it, but it's still worth trying.
Right.
So, you come to that, you come to peace with that, and just whatever happens, the contract I had with myself was, you'll be a better flute player at the end of this process
Right.
than you were at the beginning. So that is a victory. That will be, whatever the outcome, you will have raised your game. You'll have strengthened your mental skills. You'll be playing the flute better than you were a few months ago.
Right.
And so I know we're going to probably get into Alexander technique later in the conversation, but
Yes.
I just like really deployed all of that training. That whatever you do, it's going to be constructive. So as you're preparing for this audition, you're not going to get bound up in more and more tension. You're going to liberate yourself more and more, refine your coordination, refine your effort, uh, be diligent that way. Um, and um, deploying that, like really, really leaning into the beautiful Alexander technique philosophy of constructive conscious command of yourself, meaning like down to the nth degree, whatever you repeat. Sometimes we can flail about in the practice room just doing sort of meaningless repetitions,
Right.
like just being so conscious, like, okay, what can I improve there? And how would I go? I'm not going to just throw myself at it again, but how can I change my coordination to get the result I want in this like moment to moment awareness, like just perhaps doing that more than I've ever done in my life before, and I've done a lot of that. But also there's just whatever you do, you're going to be a better player, and just really walking the talk with that. Not just to be positive thinking, not just kind of Pollyanna-ish,
Right.
but really nitty gritty. And I worked so hard. Um, I also, I actually also delved into um, performance psychology. I'm not really somebody that suffers a lot from nerves, but I often don't play my best in audition situations. Uh, Sometimes it's hard to just be comfortable and just be yourself and offer what you know how to offer. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of that, and I actually had a one-on-one session with Noah Kagayama, he has a wonderful website called The Bulletproof Musician. He's a performance psychologist, and that's his website's a wonderful resource. He's a wonderful, great resource for us as musicians. Whether one-on-one or through his courses or through his website. And, I had a wonderful chat, and I just talked about all the vulnerabilities that, I'm going to be competing against my students. I don't want my colleagues in Pittsburgh to feel like I'm betraying them. That was also a huge concern. These are
Of
people I
course.
love in Pittsburgh and value, and I love working with them. I didn't want them to feel I was betraying them as a friend, and so things like that. And then also we talked about, you're already an established player, and you know, humiliation of self. So we just talked through all of these
Right.
things, and they're not necessarily tensions that you can resolve because I mean anything might happen.
Right.
You could crash and burn in the audition,
Right.
but somehow just it was a process of making your peace with all of those things, and then also approaching them constructively. So with like just preparing like never before with the constructiveness and refining and um, using the Alexander philosophy. One of the big principles of Alexander technique is just refusing to end game. So you don't grasp at the result. You instead focus moment to moment on how you're using the body, how you actually achieve the results you want, not just focusing on the results you want.
Right.
So that's the big one about walking the talk. That's one of the hardest ones, to let go of the outcome and
Sure.
pay attention. And
Yeah.
so I then delved a lot into what psychologists call growth psychology. So meaning that like when you're meeting a challenge, not to be diminished by it, not to contract, not to become smaller, but instead to become more expansive in your thinking, in your uh, stability. So I find that really, really fascinating to delve into, and it's so great to learn from athletes, to learn from other disciplines,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
these are things that can be learned. And
Yeah.
so I did a lot of that. I also did a lot of I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard of Don Green.
Oh,
Actually, I think
absolutely.
Don Green was one of Noah Kagayama's mentors,
Right.
and so
Right.
they worked together early on in Noah's career. Don Green wrote two books, Audition Success and Performance Success.
Oh, oh, okay.
And his background is in sports. His background is definitely in sports, and then
Okay.
especially golfers, and then he moved it more into working with musicians.
Okay.
Noah Kageyama was a Juilliard trained violinist
I see.
who then went on to get his PhD in psychology, and it's so great for musicians because back in my day when I was a student, we just had to muddle along. We had to just figure it out ourselves. And now there are the musical world is catching up. We can
Right.
learn from this
The sporting
sports.
world, absolutely. I'm actually a fanatic hacking golfer, uh, and so I've seen what the golf industry has done and where they put their investments into performance practice, and how that's created several generations now of young, great players, men and women, who are so finely tuned to every aspect of the game, of their body, of the process of getting ready to play and to improvement. It's quite amazing, and yeah, I think you're right. We have a long way to go in music in catching up with what the athletes are dealing with today. Of course, if we were paid the same amount as the athletes, then maybe the industry would catch up with us. But it's an interesting analogy that you make. And so one question that comes from this: when you were a student at the Royal Academy of Music, preparing for auditions from time to time, I would imagine. Do you now have a different perspective on the whole audition process, I imagine, from what you're indicating, than what you did maybe 30 years ago?
Yeah, well, taking British auditions is very different from taking American auditions, and that's something we could get into. Uh, I have always loved playing. I love playing the flute. I love performing. I love making music. Uh, I always with the British auditions, when I was growing up, it's much less intense high pressure because what they do in the British auditions is they take a selection of people that they're interested in and offer trials. And then it's like these reality shows. It's like Survivor. They rotate people,
Yeah.
rotate people in and out of the orchestra, and then you know weed people out, and then the last person standing gets the job.
Right.
So it's not all writing on the audition. And then also, uh, there would always be Mozart and another piece, usually of your own choice. So you get a chance to perform, and then you do your excerpts. So much in the American auditions is writing on the excerpts
Yes.
alone. And then it took me a long time to get used to the screen and I fully understand and value the screen, but it took me a long time to get used to that because it felt like, wait, I, it, I'm not playing to anybody. I'm playing. It's like a blocking the energetic exchange. That's what it felt like to me. It wasn't protecting me with anonymity. It felt like it was blocking my communication and the way I would normally play. And then you become very self-conscious,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and
I-
aware that you're being
I-
judged.
In London and England, Scotland, do they do auditions today without a screen generally?
Well, I'm not sure what they do now because I've been away for such a long time. But all the auditions I did when I was younger were not with a screen.
Uh,
and had to me my feeling of playing was much more like I was able to offer like perform and just
right.
perform like normal. So that took a lot of getting used to.
Interesting. Yeah. I think in America, if I remember correctly, somewhere around 1970 is when the screen started to become more normalized for orchestral auditions. Prior to that, it was generally a recommendation from to the conductor. From a player the conductor respected, who would you recommend? Usually they'd recommend students of theirs or so forth, and that was the way hiring was done. Uh, or the conductor would audition several people for himself. Usually, it was male conductors in the first half of the 20th century in America, and so it was a very different process. But today, ostensibly, on paper at least, it sounds fairer. Uh, more people can audition, and hopefully less prejudice because no one knows who's performing behind the screen. But from a performance standpoint, you bring up a very good point. How sterile that situation can be when you're actually out there doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly embrace screens. I mean, I feel, having been on both sides of them, it's very necessary in our profession. And that, a way of making peace with that is, for example, in Boston, that audition was last January, shortly after Christmas, and I'd just been home in Scotland and with my family and with my aunts and uncles and cousins, and always after the Christmas meal, my cousins and my uncle are wonderful guitarists and mandolin, and they play folk music, and we always play together, uh, you know, in the evening, and it's so much fun. And I visualized my family behind the screen.
It, it,
Things like that. I
right,
was very, very, very conscious in the Boston audition of like just having enough resources mentally, um, and physically. I had a whole notebook written down of exactly what I wanted to do in my warm-ups, and also things that would inspire me, some quotations and even just certain visualizations uh like I just told you, but
yeah,
imagining I'm playing for my family because it just invites a more generous way of playing, like you just, more open-hearted
yeah,
way of playing. And I had even exercise, some breathing techniques that I knew would help my nervous system, some centering techniques. I had it all written down because of course you feel the nerves, of course you feel the walls closing in.
yeah,
And it was so great to have, when I get nervous, I get a bit spacey. And, this gave me anchors, exactly how to come back to your center, how to
right,
come back to your essence and to be able to
yeah,
do what you do and not be, diminished by the environment, which is
Well,
very high pressured.
right. Well,
Also in an open-hearted way. Yeah.
what I find interesting is how much of the mental aspect you were bringing to this audition, because seeing so many of the younger players who audition, and naturally that's what many of them go to school for. There are master's degrees throughout this country, and well, virtually all the major conservatories now devoted specifically to orchestral excerpts, orchestral training. In fact, that's what the masters are referred to, orchestral training programs. Um, but and so you see these players coming out with tremendous technical abilities, and they know all the excerpts, and they're sort of automatons. They just spit it out like it's nothing. But uh, what they lack is what obviously you brought to the gig anyway. You've had all this experience. You know how this music sounds, how it feels, how you're relating to other players playing with you, behind you, who's playing before you, who's playing after you. You've lived it, and that's something that can't be taught. That has to be experienced. And but bringing also the mental game that you've enunciated here, that's very interesting, to the point of where you actually written down things. That's very interesting. I think that's a lesson for all of us, and how to deal with situations like that, whether it's musical, whether it's dealing with our taxes, going to the accountant, going to a lawyer. It's a good thing to do, and I don't know if I've ever heard anybody really explain it in quite that fashion before. So thanks for doing that. You know.
Oh, my pleasure. I mean, one of the things from the growth psychology uh, playbook is also embracing imperfection, because we can get so brittle if we are, you know,
Yeah.
in our profession, we try so hard, and then that can make us brittle, and we lose that suppleness of the expression. And so it was very helpful, before walking on stage. And by the way, I was so grateful also to be behind a screen, because then it made me feel like I really earned this myself too. Um, so before walking on for the final behind the screen, I did some centering and some breathing exercises, and also just allowing myself to embrace imperfection. This is not going to be the perfect audition. And then you can just offer what you can offer. And
Right.
then after that, I was so excited just to get to the super final, where the screen came down for that part. And there was a chamber music component, and I just enjoyed myself so much. It was just so wonderful to sit down and play with the other
Yeah.
principals.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then one of the excerpts, Nelson's was conducting, and I got to play. That was Carmen, and I played that with Bill Hudgens on
Yeah.
clarinet and Nelson's, and it was just. Then I felt like I could just enjoy it, just be myself and just
Right.
enjoy it. And so it's
Yeah.
lovely. And so I just want to share that with people about the embracing the imperfection, because that really does allow you to breathe and
Sure.
just be human.
And for anyone in any discipline, certainly it's a lifelong endeavor to be able to do that, and really feel that you have accomplished that. But hearing it come from you now, and it's vivid because the audition was just 11 months ago or so. Um, it That's, I think, really really helpful, and I think a lot of players looking at this video might take away something they would not have thought of coming to it. So thanks for being willing to share that too.
May I offer just one other thing?
Sure.
It's quite personal, but I thought this will be the last audition I ever take. Because it is like the auditions are so, it's like walking through fire. And I what it does to your nervous system, what it does, it's a lot. It's brutal, as many of your listeners will know. And
Sure.
I thought this would be the last one I ever take. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it's fine. you know, I have a
Yeah.
wonderful job in Pittsburgh, and I so also part of taking this audition was just absolutely doing it on your own terms. Like I just thought this is going to be soulful. I'm not. If I'm going to do this audition, I'm going to do it in a soulful way that is like a culmination of everything that you trained for from the beginning. And I I took a little photo of my teacher, David Nicholson. I have a little photo of him, and he was I started studying with him when I was 11 in Scotland, and he was the one that made me just fall in love with the flute and with music. And so he was with me. He passed away many years ago, but I remember being in the green room and I waiting to go on to play, and I just had his little photo on my stand.
Well,
So these are sort of the anchors that help anchor you to your values as well in
yeah,
the midst of that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Behind me on the wall are two of my teachers and and two of my wife's teachers. We shared one teacher together, and they have all passed on. And but I like to have their pictures there because, like you said, it helps center you and bring you back to, well, why are you playing music?
Exactly.
That
Exactly.
it's not just to be what I call a gig meister. It's it's because their values and the way you felt when you were working with them. Those are the feelings you want. I want to maintain.
That's right. And then that's what you walk into. That's the sea that you're swimming in. It's not about whether you win or not. You may win, you may not. It doesn't matter
Right.
as long as you're kind of practicing those values.
Right. And I would just like to toss this out to the listeners who might not be orchestral players, maybe commercial players who certainly there are a number of woodwind doublers who look at this site and when you're going into sub for someone on a freelance gig on a Broadway show, those same type of feelings are likely to come up. And I think Lorna's um, approach to an audition process is not that different from approaching subbing for someone. And subbing in the music industry can be the most nerve-wracking and sometimes least rewarding experience there is. It's certainly one of the things that makes working as a professional musician a challenge. Whether and it could be subbing on an orchestral gig for someone who suddenly gets sick and you're having to jump in at the last moment. At that point, you have to bring not only your musical, technical abilities, you have to bring what's there in your mind as well as in your heart. And it takes a while to get to that point to see those things, I think. At least for me, it certainly did. It took a long, long time. And so, yeah, thanks. I mean, that's very different than the direction I thought we might start this interview. But I really appreciate that because this is something that's not talked about very often, if at all.
We all
Uh,
we all have a nervous system,
yeah,
and somehow befriending one's own nervous system, uh, and responding to all the different stimuli that come at you.
yes,
You're right. Whether it's going into sub somewhere or sometimes I feel every rehearsal I'm going into feels like an audition,
yeah,
uh, and it just having tools to
right,
stay
right.
steady in that and being able to
Right.
do what you're able to do.
Right, right. And one of the areas that I omitted only because today there's so little of it being done, but when I was evolving as a musician, certainly the idea of recording, studio work and recording was omnipresent in New York, and there still is a decent scene out in LA, and certainly one in London. I know from talking to Paul Edmund Davies, he seems quite busy in that regard. But going in to do a recording session, some of those same feelings, especially if you're not this, if it's not your recording session, if you're being called as a sideman to come in and nail it. Those feelings are always there, and I remember encountering many of the legendary studio musicians who were in New York, seeing them as older, experienced players when I began, and they all seemed to have a certain demeanor about them, which fits this description you've been giving. And the demeanor that they had was, first of all, they were all dressed beautifully, uh, most of them with jackets, ties, suits, but they all had their head held up high. They walked very erect, and when you would see them on the street walking, you'd say, "Well, that's a person who's pretty confident and successful." That was the vibe they emitted, and I think that has to go along with it, having that sense of inner strength, inner peace, confidence, all of that they bring to the game. That's the way you can be successful going about uh, auditioning, subbing, or just day-to-day work, which is changing every day. So there's a lot that goes into it besides just playing the notes.
Definitely.
You
And
know,
it's interesting too. I find that stuff really interesting.
I wanted to go back to your teacher since you mentioned David Nicholson, and then of course you studied with McGhee and William Bennett as your master teacher, and what you worked on with them, each of those three individuals, and their approach to teaching, and maybe how it influenced you, because you taught for a number of years at Carnegie Mellon as well, and having had that experience with three different teachers, uh, all fine players, notable players, uh, what did you get from each of them, if you could sort of narrow it down?
Yes. Uh, well, the very simple thing that I could say I got from all of them was bring the music to life. It was bring the music alive and say something. Say something with the music. That was always the absolute goal all the time. It was, and that was really enjoyable and imaginative and challenging and exciting, and that's the way they played. So that's the way they taught. Where is this phrase going? What is this phrase saying? What about this harmony? I remember Wib once in a lesson saying, listen to this line of Bach. Is that not the most beautiful? Like a sense of wonder and a sense of curiosity and a sense of being very enlivened by themselves, by what they were doing. And
Right.
I always say to my students, it's like, your job, your job is to help all of us feel alive, including yourself.
Yeah.
And when I listened to David Nicholson, so my teacher David Nicholson in Scotland was the principal of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and my parents would take my sister and I to concerts often in Glasgow on the weekends, and we'd schlep up to Glasgow, and my ear would just be fixed on the flute because it was just the most enlivening sound, and the way he played.
Was that how you got into the flute? Was it by listening to that orchestra David Nicholson's playing, or were you already playing flute by then?
I was already playing flute
I
by
see.
then,
I see.
but that's what really was captivating. Like I
Right.
it was so full of life, and then that just made me feel more
Right.
alive, and I just loved the sound of it. And so, and then with William Bennett, that was the worst crime in a lesson would be if you were not saying anything with the music. That was just unconscionable. That was just that or playing out of tune. Those were the two things that were just non-negotiable. They were just non-negotiable. You could not say nothing, and you would not tolerate bad intonation. And so, so that's the broad answer to your question. Um, okay, so David Nicholson and William Bennett, they both studied with Jeffrey Gilbert, legendary Jeffrey Gilbert, and so there was great, fundamental training there. So my very first masterclass I ever played in was when I was about 13 or 12 or 13, was for Jeffrey Gilbert. He came to Glasgow
Wow.
and he, for the college students, but David Nicholson sneaked me into the master class and I got to play. And the great Jeffrey Gilbert told me, you know, practice your long tones for 15 minutes every day, and we practiced the tone in the master class. And okay, it's like the voice of God. Okay, practice your long tones. So from the age of 13, I was in love with long tones. From age 30, I love the sound of long tones, and so the great fundamentals with that. Also, pedagogically, David Nicholson used Trevor Wise practice books, because they're so systematic. There's your
Yes.
tone book, your articulation, your fingers. It was so systematic, and so very, very strong fundamentals. I mean, David was wonderful at putting students together, building their technique, and
Right.
and absolute priority in the quality of the sound and in expressive phrasing. And then that was further developed when I went to study with Wib. My first year at the Royal Academy, I studied with Michi, and Michi was brilliant with all the technique, and all the Moise technique. I mean, for the first year, I was not allowed to play any pieces. It was
No,
hardcore.
no, no repertoire orchestral excerpts. No, just technical studies and
Just
getting the.
Tafnel and Gober, exercises, just really getting command of the instrument. So that then when I went to study with Wib, my second year on, he could just focus on the music, because you just knew how to play the instrument, and then he could focus more on musical ideas. And I remember the first time I heard Wib live in the teaching studio. It was like this again. This sound was so enlivening, and it was like a tsunami of warmth that just filled every corner of the room, and that such a gorgeous, gorgeous, rich sound. So there's the pedagogy, but also just learning by osmosis, like from these great examples, like David Nicholson's silvery, beautifully vivacious way of playing, and then the warmth and richness of Wib's tone and the myriad of colors he would get. So some of my very best lessons with Wib were on simple melodies. So there were two books, the
The
Moist,
Moyes.
24 Easy
Or
Melodic Studies, which are not easy at all.
no.
They're really, really, really hard to play very well. I mean, if you really go into it. So a lot of that was just really learning the nuts and bolts that Moyes had learned from listening to great singers and string players, and giving us the framework of these little melodies. And Wib would spend hours just teaching a simple phrase, and how do you develop the vibrato, how do you develop the line to this beautiful suspension, and how do you do that repeated note so that it's not mushy, and so it's enunciated, it's not accented, but it's like you're speaking through the instrument, and how do you taper the vibrato to change the energy and the sound so that you're really emphasizing the most important notes and not just kind of vibrating over everything willy-nilly. And then uh, and then how do you build your phrases? How do you create the architecture and
Right.
create a coherent musical conversation? And then the other book was Tone Development Through Interpretation, which is like great melodies from opera or from violin repertoire or symphonies, and you learn how to create atmosphere and tone colors and yeah.
Yeah, no, it's now uh, all of the listeners, I'm sure all the flutists know exactly what you're saying. And for the doublers who are listening, please get at least tone development through interpretation, de la sonarite, and the 24 easy, simple melodies of Moyes. Though at least those three publications. Moyes published, I mean, there must be 20 books at least of Moyes studies, but those three are so essential to anyone playing flute of any style of music. It really is important, and I'm thankful that you mentioned those, Lorna. Did all of your teachers play at the lessons with you? Did they actually play? Which is something also that needs to be stressed. Many people are teachers out there listening, and again, I've had teachers who were wonderful, and some of them did not play. Maybe some of them. My main saxophone clarinet teacher, Joe Allen, had major uh, dental work that sort of ended his playing career, so he could demonstrate certain things, but didn't play much. But the most effective teacher I had was Tom Neifinger, who's middle picture there, and he played all the time, both flute and piano at the lessons. And the impressions that one gets from a teacher, a teacher is a great player playing, you cannot put into words. It lasts a lifetime, and it's so important for the teacher to demonstrate and play for the student. It's let me see, an interview I had about a year ago with the wonderful clarinetist John Manassi. John talked about his early lessons on clarinet with David Weber. And John had played saxophone first, and he began clarinet with David Weber as his very first teacher, which is an incredible thing to have a great player and a devoted teacher as your first teacher. And John said the reason he kept coming back every week in the early days before he really got hooked on the clarinet was just to hear his teacher play, because he loved the sound. He wanted to just hear that sound. And so, again, another important point about having the teacher play for their students all the time, not just to phone it in, make the assignments. To play for the students can be a life-changing experience. You know,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
and uh, now, how has the teaching that you went through with Nicholson and the Bennetts affected your teaching over the years that you taught at Carnegie Mellon? How have they influenced your teaching?
Oh, everything. That's the root of everything. You know, that's what I want. That's the legacy I want to pass on to my students. I mean, of course, you bring your own ideas and your own sort of technique to it. I mean, I have developed quite a lot of my own sort of tone exercises, and that's partly coming from my Alexander technique obsession, and how we use the body like an instrument, you know. So there's, you bring your own stuff to it too, but fundamentally this idea um, of bringing the music alive, and I would say it's something that we underestimate. There's so many pressures on the students now, to get a job, and it's so expensive, to go to college, and the pressures on them are immense. And sometimes it's it's like sometimes they end up playing um, with a lot of fear, and and sometimes it's almost like moving mountains to try and take that pressure off them so that they can actually be expressive. And but I feel like that's part of my life's work, is to just keep that flame alive, and help guide students in a way that, give them the chops, give them the resources and the tools technically to be able to do whatever they want to do musically, but always at the service of the music, and just to really just try and give them rocket fuel to always be saying something with the music, because I feel very strongly about this. I mean, I feel like we we have a responsibility. I mean, classical music is that there's hardly any classical music education in our schools now, and so we're losing ground, and people don't have a relationship to it anymore, and we're losing audiences. And part of it is that if we are not enlivened by what we're doing, or if we're playing from a defensive position of fear rather than an open-hearted, generous position, which is quite hard to do under pressure. But you can learn how to do it. And if there's not that exchange of energy, the audience receives nothing. All they can do is maybe admire. That's fine instrumental playing, but they're left cold. And they won't be so inclined to come back. So I think it's just really imperative that we don't forget what our mission is.